My name is Judith Thompson. I'm the Victims Commissioner for Northern Ireland. It's a very specific post which I was appointed to 2 years ago by our First Minister and our Deputy First Minister, and the sole focus of my job is to promote the best interests of those people harmed during our troubles here. So the Commission and the role that I occupy was set up in legislation really as a direct impact of the Good Friday Agreement. My job to advocate, to support, to seek to make sure that the needs of those who've been harmed are met in legislation. That is also sits alongside a government department with a commitment to provide for victims and survivors, and with the establishment of the Victims and Survivors Service, which has a budget of £13 million a year and the job of looking after those people who are registered as victims and survivors. In addition to that, I have a very important body to advise me and to consult with in relation to the interests of victims and survivors, and that is my Victims and Survivors Forum. That forum is made up of people who have themselves suffered harm and meet the definition of victim as set out in legislation. There are 23 of those people at the moment. They come from every part of Northern Ireland. They represent a balance of gender, of community of origin, and of origin of harm. So there are people on that forum who have been harmed at the hands of the army. There are people on that forum who were themselves soldiers. And that is just one example. Every different background and experience is represented. And the job of that group is to help advise me and help us determine in a broader way what is in the best interests of the greater numbers of people who have suffered harm, regardless of who harmed them, regardless of their political views or community affiliation. Just finding the best interests and the way to protect the best interests of victims and survivors as a whole is the core job of this office. Between 1966 and 1998, 3,725 people lost their lives in Northern Ireland, and since then 150 more have lost their lives right up to the present. There were 47,500 people injured, and more than 213,000 people still suffer ill health, mental ill health in Northern Ireland as a consequence of their experience here. So that leaves us with a shocking legacy in terms of people's experience and in terms of our mental health. Of those 3,700 people who died, there are still maybe as many as 1,600 of those deaths which haven't been dealt with fully by an investigative process. So many people still seeking truth and justice. In terms of the mental health legacy, our current mental health services are really stretched to try and deal with people's needs, and we have a really significant issue emerging with the impact on the next generation of young people coming through whose homes and communities have been harmed by the Troubles. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement brought the Troubles and the killings in Northern Ireland more or less to a close. And that was an incredibly significant moment, personally, community-wise, culturally, for everybody in Northern Ireland. But whilst the Good Friday Agreement set on a basis where both different traditions in Northern Ireland could come together and be in government together, it also made statements around victims' rights being respected and around victims, the harm that victims had suffered being addressed over time. Whilst it mentioned those things, it didn't fully address how that would happen, and that was a very difficult position for victims and survivors. Many people who lost people they loved, lost their health, lost their businesses. Those people, it wasn't an easy thing for some of them to support the integration into government of all of those who'd caused harm, really, on all sides. and to see things like prisoner releases, which were an important part of that agreement. And for most of the people I talk to, they say, look, that was hard, but we mostly supported it because it made life better for everybody. But at the same time, we supported it on the basis that we were told that our needs, our rights, our experiences would be addressed as well. And broadly, I would say over the nearly 20 years now that have passed, that really hasn't happened in a number of very significant ways. So nearly 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement, there are still a number of very significant issues which we have to address in order to dealing with the past. And a lot of those live in the area of justice. So of the people who were killed and of the many, many more people who were bereaved in Northern Ireland, there are still 1,118 deaths sitting within the police's legacy investigations branch, not yet investigated. So that is 1,118 families from all parts of the community in Northern Ireland who still don't know the circumstances in which their loved one died, who still haven't seen any kind of formal investigation or consideration of prosecution. Now, in relation to these issues, the Victims Charter, the EU Victims Directive is incredibly important because this is a legal process. These are criminal investigations which have not been progressed. And for those families waiting for some access to whatever degree of truth or justice is possible, and obviously there are limitations to that so far down the road, for those people, this is where their rights, their entitlements and their protection are set out in a way which can enable any new institutions to be fit for purpose for victims and survivors. So the right to know the progress of your case. There are people currently who've been waiting for 40 years to find out when that happened in relation to the death of somebody they loved. But if we have a new historical investigations process, which is what we have a proposal for, then the Victims Directive will apply to those cases. And those people have a right to know the progress of their case. They have a right to be supported. They have a right to know if there is a decision not to prosecute, why that decision's been made, and they have a right to challenge it. They have a right to access a restorative process if they wish it, and only if they wish it. And they have a right to be represented and supported. So those are critical things to make sure that when we deal with the past, when we deal with outstanding investigations, we do it in a way which really respects and gives primary importance to the needs and the rights of those people who have been harmed. In addition to those 1,100 and more investigations which are still outstanding, there are 55 cases which sit in a civil process waiting for legacy inquests. These are cases where either there was no inquest or there was not a competent inquest or new evidence has come, and where, in the view of the Attorney General, there is a need to have new inquest. Some of those families who are waiting for those 55 inquests have been waiting for 20 and more years. At the moment, we have proposals for legislation to deal with these outstanding issues. Those proposals are in draft state. They include a new historical investigations unit which will perform a policing investigatory function, but outside of and independent of the police, because of the nature of some of these killings, that independence is important. They include an oral history archive, which is a community dialogue and a way of promoting reconciliation and promoting understanding and learning from past experiences so that we don't repeat them. And also an information retrieval process for those people who either won't have the opportunity of a criminal investigation because the evidence is no longer good enough, or even sometimes for people who may just choose this as the preferable way to go. For them, there is, again, based on legislation, a process of information retrieval on offer. However, that information retrieval still relates to the violent death of somebody they loved. And it is still, as victims and survivors, critical that they are supported, that their rights are supported, that their best interests are supported as they go through that process. These bodies, these three pieces of draft legislation, are part of the Stormont House Agreement, a political agreement that was reached between all our political parties in Northern Ireland. Whilst those three pieces of legislation are ready to go ahead, there are other important issues still sitting out. One is that we need and we have plans for a much improved mental health trauma service in Northern Ireland to deal with trauma and transgenerational impact. Now that's not dependent on legislation, but it's an incredibly important civic process that will run alongside. The other thing for anyone watching this video to think about is, whilst these events mostly occurred in Northern Ireland, not all of them did. Some of them occurred in the Republic of Ireland, some occurred in England, and some occurred across Europe. So there are people in all of those jurisdictions who will be impacted on by new historical investigations. And those people who are their representatives or the support people outside of Northern Ireland really need to be very tuned in to the proposals for new legislation here at the moment. We may see those proposals launched for consultation by sometime around the end of January, beginning of February this year. It's critically important because that consultation will take place right across the UK, but it may be relevant for people living outside the UK as well. And it's important that those who are able to offer their clients, the people they're working with, the opportunity to engage with and to be heard around these proposals, to make sure that they're fit for purpose from a victims and survivors point of view. And then when they're enacted, which hopefully they will be sometime in the next year or so, then that people are able to access those institutions and to use them in a way that really helps victims and survivors to get what they wish to achieve in terms of access to truth and justice insofar as that's achievable, and to acknowledgement of harm, and to support and mental health support and services to make life better for them. At the end of the day, that's incredibly important for those people, but it's more than that as well. It's incredibly important for all of us here in Northern Ireland in terms of how we move forward from a very difficult path that continues to impact on our present, and move forward in a way that actually helps us make sure we don't repeat the same mistakes, that builds reconciliation and helps to avoid repetition of that kind of harm.